may have seen our video for the Canon 5D series where we went through 5D Mark 1, 2, 3, and of course, the 5D Mark 4. Well, we thought we wouldn't just stop with Canon, why not dive into Sony as well, because it's Throwback Thursday. Welcome back to Throwback Thursday, where we take a slightly closer look at some of the more interesting items in our park cameras used department. Now, you may have seen our video a few weeks ago where we did a full video kind of exploring the Canon 5D range, comparing them a little bit, went out, took some photos with the Canon 5D Mark 1 through to the 5D Mark 4, but we didn't want to just stop with Canon, so we're going to dive into some other brands. And the first brand that sprung to mind really was Sony. They've got so many interesting cameras. They've got different kind of ranges. You know, you've got the A7 series, which we're going to talk about today. Next week, we're going to talk about the A7R series. There's all kinds of different cameras in there. I really like Sony. I really like shooting with Sony. This is being shot on a Sony A7 III. Most of the videos on the channel, to be honest, are shot on a Sony A7 III, at least the parts of me speaking. I just really like shooting video with them and stills as well. Of course, in terms of mirrorless cameras, I think they're great. You know, they offer that full frame performance in the mirrorless package, and they've really gone for it and created some really impressive cameras. So this week we're going to focus on the A7 series. So looking at the Sony A7, the A7 II, and the A7 III. Then next week we're going to dive into the A7R series. So the A7R through to the new A7R IV. Woo, which is quite a camera. But this week, let's focus on the A7 series. Like I say, my camera choice is the A7 III, but the A7 and the A7 II are still really good options, depending on what kind of stuff you're going for, whether it's stills, whether it's video, and they're both still widely available. I'll pop links to everything down in the description so you can check out all three cameras. Let's just dive into it. So I've got all three cameras here, the A7, the A7 II, and of course the A7 III. But let's start by talking about the sensor and the processor with the camera. Now, all three cameras have a very respectable full frame sensor with 24 megapixels. So you can get nice performance from all three, nice kind of crisp pictures. And to be honest, 24 megapixels is enough for a professional user. If you're not printing massive, that is enough. That was kind of the point of the original A7, you know, the mirrorless camera. It is the full frame pro camera that you would use, but in a much smaller, I mean, look at that, much smaller compact system. Now, while they all offer very nice images, something they've all excelled at is low light performance. And they just get better through the range as well, with the A7 III really being probably one of my absolute go-to cameras for low light performance. I just find it to be incredible. But it all started with the A7. They've all got good low light performance. And like I say, it just all culminates with the A7 III. As well as that, they all offer a very high dynamic range. And the amount that you can push and pull the images from these cameras is incredible. Now, that great sensor is not only great for stills, but for video as well. And Sony cameras generally are regarded as very good hybrid cameras for still shooters and for video shooters. The A7 II was of course notable as one of the first full frame mirrorless cameras to have in-body 5-axis image stabilization. It makes a big difference for all kinds of things. Video shooting, you know, that handheld video shooting is a lot easier with the in-body stabilization, and of course low light shooting. You know, you can use a much slower shutter speed handheld because of the stabilization in the camera. In terms of image quality, they are somewhat similar between the three cameras, with low light performance, high ISO performance, just generally improving as you go up to the A7 III. But having things like that in-body stabilization in the A7 II, having things like that just makes for a much more pleasant shooting experience. So as you go up the range, things just get much nicer. And depending on the kind of thing you're going for, you know, eye autofocus in the A7 III obviously helps. And of course, things like low light performance just get better as you go up. Speaking of that low light performance, it's helped by a back illuminated sensor inside the A7 III. And when you combine that with the Bionz X processor, it achieves a data readout speed about twice as fast as the A7 II. Now, moving on to lens mount and compatibility, there's no real winner here. They're all E-mount cameras. They all have a large number of lenses you can choose from to kind of mount on these cameras. There's a lot of Sony native lenses, especially now. There's loads, but you can also use the A-mount lenses with an adapter. You can use Sigma, Samyang, Zeiss lenses. There's a lot to look at here. Sony have really supported that E-mount ecosystem, and it definitely shows, you know, whether you go for any of these cameras, the actual ecosystem of lenses is vast and there's a lot to look at. Okay, so let's move on to video, which I think is quite an important aspect of Sony cameras. A lot of people use Sony cameras for video. I do. I use Sony cameras for pretty much all of my video. I really like using them. And it's definitely something that people like. It's a hybrid system, stills and video. Now the A7 and the A7 II are both able to shoot full HD, so that's 1080p at up to 60 frames per second. And with the A7 III, that's been massively improved. So you've got 4K shooting now at up to 30 frames a second. And full HD 1080p shooting at up to 120 frames a second. So that's super nice. Ooh, slow motion. And it looks so good. One of the big things about the A7 III was that it was a full pixel readout when you're shooting 4K. That means it's using the whole sensor. Now that doesn't sound like that much of a thing. Maybe it's a bit techie, but actually it means that the actual quality of the 4K is essentially closer to 6K and then downsampled to 4K. So you're just getting rid of things like artifacts and just things that you don't want in there. It's a much higher quality looking 4K. It really shows, very, very crisp. Oh, it's very, very nice. It's one of the reasons I shoot with it. Of course, like I mentioned earlier, with the addition of the in-body image stabilization in the A7 II, and of course in the A7 III as well, that makes handheld video shooting much easier on these cameras. I shoot handheld with the A7 III a lot. I tend not to use a gimbal if I don't have to. And I've got to say, it is a massive plus to be able to do that. Big part of that is because of that in-body image stabilization. Just makes it so steady. You get that nice smooth footage. Now let's move on to autofocus. Now this is one of the big reasons I use Sony. Autofocus in Sony is so good. It's actually ridiculous, especially on things like the A7 III. And of course, next week, we'll talk about the A7R IV. Ooh. Now with the Sony A7, you had 99 phase detect points, 25 contrast detect points. That was the same in the A7 II, but with the A7 III, it moved up to 693 phase detect points and 425 contrast detect points. That's crazy. That's such a massive leap. And I've got to say, it is actually relatively noticeable. Now the autofocus is certainly no slouch in the A7 and the A7 II. It's actually really quite good. It's also worth noting that while they have the same number of autofocus points, the A7 II was actually about 30% faster than the A7. But the A7 III really does have vastly improved autofocus, taking a lot from the very impressive Sony A9. It's able to focus down to -3 EV, again, perfect for low light performance. And of course, it's got the extraordinarily impressive eye autofocus. Now, if you've never used Sony eye autofocus, we've actually got a video coming out soon all about just how good is Sony eye autofocus. Because it is industry leading, it is the best that I've used, easily it's the best that I've used. It is incredible. Now, when the A7 III came out, it was already very, very good. You pressed the button to activate it and it would work pretty much flawlessly. There are a few kind of hiccups here and there, but otherwise it was great. But Sony, not one to let greatness lie, and it sounds like I'm a bit of a Sony fanboy here, but really it is actually that good. Anyone who's used it will tell you this is genuinely this good. So they've updated it with a firmware update. Now we did a video with the firmware update. I'll pop a link to that down in the description so you can check that out. This applies to the A7 III and the A7R III, where they vastly improved the eye autofocus. No longer do you have to press a button to activate it. It just activates on a half press of the shutter. It's a continuous autofocus mode as well, so it'll track the eye until you take that picture. If it loses the eye for any moment, it'll just go to normal face tracking and head tracking, and then if it loses that, subject tracking, and it'll go right back to the eye the second that's back in frame. There's lots of cool little tricks you can do with it as well, like set a priority, so you've got one person, you always want the camera to focus on their eye in a group if they're available. Amazing. I was speaking with Robert Pugh, who's a Sony photographer. Again, I'll pop a link to that interview down in the description so you can check that out. He uses the Sony systems for wedding photography and sets the bride as the main priority for eye autofocus, which means in the crowded church or the chapel or wherever it is, in the crowd of people, when he's taking the photo, it'll always find her first and lock onto her eye. Amazing. I mean, it's such an advanced system. And honestly, until you've used it and seen it happening, it's so good. It's difficult to believe how good it is, but it really does work astonishingly well. Now, like I say, A7 II, A7, certainly not bad for autofocus. There were eye autofocus systems in there as well. It's just that there is a very noticeable difference when you go to the A7 III. There's very much an immediate leap in autofocus technology. I haven't even mentioned the animal eye autofocus, where Sony added eye autofocus for cats and dogs into the a7 III. Amazing. Now moving on to speed, the A7 and the A7 II could both shoot 5 frames a second. Very respectable, and for most people, absolutely fine. The A7 III doubles that, could do 10 frames a second. It can also do that in silent shooting mode and with autofocus engaged as well. It's really quite impressive, so it's really quite fast. Now for most people, 5 frames a second is going to be absolutely fine, but it is quite nice to have that 10 frames a second, especially in situations like maybe a wedding or something like that. I think it's quite a nice thing to have. Now in terms of the build and the design of the cameras, let's talk about the EVF, so the electronic viewfinder, and the tilt screen at the back. Honestly, there's not a huge amount of difference between the 3 cameras here. In terms of size and resolution, pretty much the same. There is a gentle increase in resolution as you go up the models for the rear screen, but otherwise the EVF is basically the same. They're all absolutely fine. You know, compared to some that are out there now, they're not the best, but they all work absolutely fine. And I've never had a problem using mine. Now, yes, you're gonna get better EVFs and things like that on newer A7R4, for example, has an incredible EVF, but within the kind of core A7 range, these are absolutely fine, and there's no real difference between the 3 cameras. In terms of build and design, they're all pretty similar. The size and the shape and the weight is pretty similar. They do get a little bit heavier as you go up the range. So the A7 III is actually, when you hold the A7 I, I guess, and the A7 III, it is noticeably a little bit heavier. But to be honest, it's nothing that would bother me ever. It's nothing that would ever cause me any issues. You know, there's so much extra packed in with the in-body stabilization. Same with the 2, with the in-body stabilization in there. I'd expect a little bit more weight. They're still quite a lot lighter than a DSLR. In terms of button placement and ergonomics, the A7 III moved the dedicated movie button round to by the electronic viewfinder, which is very, very nice, instead of over on the side. I think the shutter is probably nicer on the A7 III and the A7 II, rather than the A7 I, which I don't like quite as much. Otherwise, they all feel very nice. They're all nicely designed. I think the grip on the A7 III is probably my favorite. There's not a huge amount of difference there, but it just feels nicer than the A7 I. The A7 II and 3 both feel like they've been refined quite a bit more than the A7 I. And then finally, of course, battery life. Well, the A7 is going to give you around 340 shots. The A7 II, around 350, so not much difference there. But the A7 III, around 610 shots. And I must say, from personal use, again, I don't have as much experience with the A7 II or the A7 I, but with the A7 III, which I use every single day of my life pretty much, I find the battery life to be actually outrageously good. I'm pretty sure I've got more than 610 shots on a single charge before. The fact that you can charge it via USB-C when it's plugged onto the computer, I find that very, very useful. It means that I never use my battery charger. I just plug my camera in to download the photos and I just leave it charging while I'm editing stuff and doing things like that. It's a very, very nice system all round, but certainly the battery life is not a concern I've ever had using the A7 III. So there are the 3 cameras, the A7, the A7 II, and of course, the A7 III. Now, like I said in the video, I may have sounded a little bit like a Sony fanboy. I'm trying not to be, I'm really trying not to be. I just really like the ecosystem. I love the Sony cameras, I love the Sony lenses. I just really like shooting video and stills with it. So it's hard for me not to get excited. Now, I get excited about everything, so it's hard for me not to get excited about something like this. If you have any questions about anything we've talked about in the video, pop them down in the comments. If you have any experience yourself or any thoughts on any of this, pop it down there as well. I'll put a full list to all of the items we talked about down in the description so you can check them out for yourself. Next week, we're going to be doing the A7R series. So A7R1, I guess you call it. They're not technically Mark 1 because they're just A7R, but A7R through to the A7R4. Oh, very nice. We've got a couple of other videos about the A7R4 coming up because, of course, this is all part of our Christmas content calendar, so there's new videos every single day. With that said, I will see you tomorrow, and as always, do the old like and subscribe, do all that stuff. That really helps me out. You know, really would genuinely appreciate it. Otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, thanks for watching.